All right, and thank you to you at home for joining us this hour. You know, the good thing is, I was just talking to Joy about like having some time off, you know, being able to relax a little bit. I mean, this is a difficult job, daily production, you know, you got to do stuff. Luckily, Fridays in August, nothing ever happens. So pretty much everybody phoned it in today. Nothing's going on, right? All right. Starting in middle school, there's a thing you can do called Model UN, Model United Nations. It's an educational thing. They do it for college kids, for kids in high school, and for kids in middle school. It's a very cool idea. You get assigned to represent a country, and then as the delegate for that country, you learn about diplomacy and international relations and the workings of international institutions by you acting out your assigned country's best interests, along with all the other kids that are assigned to be all the other countries in this mock UN environment. It's cool. Some schools do debate club. My school did mock trial. Some schools do Model UN. It's a cool thing. Last March, when he was zipping his way through the Republican primaries on his way to the nomination to be the Republican Party's candidate for president in 2016, last March, then candidate Donald Trump sat down with the editorial board of the Washington Post. And in that meeting, he finally answered a question that reporters had been bugging him about for weeks. He was becoming the frontrunner for the Republican nomination for president. But despite having made it that far politically, nobody really knew where to place him on the number line of Republican politics, particularly on issues like national security and foreign policy. So people kept asking him, Mr. Trump, who is your foreign policy team? People had been asking him that for weeks, and they'd started to make fun of the fact that he didn't seem to have a foreign policy team. Well, on that day in March at the Washington Post, with kind of a dramatic flourish, he produced a piece of paper that had a list of 5 names on it. He made a big show out of getting the paper from one of his aides, then he spread it out and he read off the paper to the Washington Post editorial board. And in so doing, he announced his list of 5 people who he said were his foreign policy advisors. And nobody had ever heard of any of them. And as a whole, they turned out to be very strange choices. For example, one of them turned out to be a guy named Carter Page, a small-time business guy who had worked for Merrill Lynch in Russia for a while. He had also turned up in an FBI investigation of a Russian spy ring that was operating at a New York bank. He turned up in that investigation as somebody who had provided information to the Russian agents. Another person on the list was a guy who said on his resume that he had taught for years at the National Defense University, when in fact he had not taught for years at the National Defense University. Another one of the 5 people on this list listed on his resume that among his awards and honors, not only had he participated in Model UN, in Model UN, he'd been the representative for the United States. Hey, you know, if you're going to advise an actual U.S. president someday, that's probably pretty good practice, right? And what luck, presumably if that kid had been assigned to be the delegate for Liechtenstein at Model UN, then he wouldn't have turned up in the U.S. presidential election as a foreign policy advisor a few years later down the road. So Trump, with this flourish, pulls out his list of 5 names. He unveils his 5-person foreign policy team. And it was a weird thing. And it continued to be a weird thing. Carter Page ended up under scrutiny for his travels to Russia and his meetings in Russia in the middle of the presidential campaign, which is now under scrutiny for its contacts with Russia during that time. The kid who listed Model UN on his resume to be a Trump foreign policy advisor, he made the news this week because among the 20,000 pages of documents the Trump campaign has now handed over to congressional committees investigating the Russia issue, there are records of at least a half-dozen times when the Model UN kid wrote to other people on the Trump campaign insisting that he was able to get them all meetings with high-level Russians, including his efforts to set up a meeting with Putin himself. Where did these guys come from? And how did they end up as part of Trump's campaign? I mean, Trump doesn't seem to have known George Papadopoulos, the Model UN kid, or Carter Page, the guy who was in with the Russian spies. I mean, he doesn't seem to have known these guys before he was running this campaign for president. How did they end up on his presidential campaign in what the candidate described as these senior, very important roles as his foreign policy team? Same question applies to the guy who ran his campaign for a while, Paul Manafort. He wasn't connected to Donald Trump before he mysteriously ended up running the Trump campaign last year. It has been unequivocally confirmed to us that as late as January of last year, Paul Manafort and Donald Trump had no relationship. But by March of last year, Paul Manafort was running Donald Trump's convention operation, and by May, he was running the whole Trump campaign. Where did he come from? Out of all the people in the country, out of all the Republicans in the country, why did Trump pick this guy, who he didn't know, who had been out of American politics for decades, while instead he was doing business and political work for Putin-connected oligarchs and dictators? Why pick him, of all people? And then once Trump won the election, why did he end up with this guy in charge of foreign policy, running the State Department? Rex Tillerson had never met Donald Trump before the presidential election. Rex Tillerson's selection as Secretary of State is explained now as having been a recommendation to Trump from Condoleezza Rice and from Obama's defense secretary, Bob Gates. As if Trump was taking tons of advice from people like that when he was setting up his cabinet. I mean, remember, Trump installed his bankruptcy lawyer as ambassador to Israel. He put his top fundraiser in as Treasury Secretary. He put his son's wedding planner in charge of federal housing in New York and New Jersey. He named his son-in-law and his daughter as senior presidential advisors. He made his bodyguard the director of Oval Office operations. He put Newt Gingrich's wife in Rome as the ambassador to the Vatican. You really think he held out on the job of Secretary of State until he found someone Condoleezza Rice approved of? I mean, it remains a strange thing that Donald Trump picked Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State. But Tillerson did have decades of experience with Vladimir Putin. He's thought to be closer to Putin than almost any other American. Putin pinned Russia's highest civilian honor on Rex Tillerson's lapel just a few years ago, around the time that Tillerson's company and Russia completed the largest oil deal in the history of the world, a $500 billion oil deal between Russia and Exxon that is off now, but could be back on in an instant if only those U.S. sanctions on Russia could be rolled back. So this is this thing that nags at me and has been keeping me awake on and off for like more than a year now. Where do these folks come from? How do these people find their way into that inner circle? I mean, there have been a whole bunch of people in the Trump campaign and in the Trump administration who are, forgive me, weird choices for the jobs that they have had and for the roles that they have played. In terms of my sleep schedule, it's almost comforting now. It's at least clarifying now to look at all those weird choices and realize that some inexplicable connection to Russia and Russian interests appears to be the common denominator in all of those weird choices. There's at least a theme, right? With this one other guy, though, he doesn't fit the theme. He was an equally weird choice, but he doesn't fit that same theme. You can't explain him the same way. This is the trailer for the Val Kilmer movie he once produced about a mad scientist who locks people in a steam room and holds them hostage there while the girls hold each other and take off their bikini tops at like random times. It sounds kind of porny. It is. But the message of the movie is about the mad scientist's murderous, crazy scheme, which is to convince people through this hostage crisis in the bikini sauna that there is such thing as global warming.
Why are you here?
Hundreds of millions of people are going to die. That's a fact.
Hundreds of millions of people will die. How?
Global warming.
That's how you know he's crazy. This one guy who doesn't fit the sort of pattern of a weird choice for the Trump campaign and the Trump administration, he produced the mad scientist kills people because he believes in global warming, sexy sauna scene horror movie. He also produced a movie that is supposed to be nonfiction, a documentary, that shows and proves that one of the guys from Duck Dynasty isn't just a guy who has an amazing beard and sells duck calls. He's a living prophet here on Earth. He is the torchbearer, sent here from heaven to show humanity the way. That movie, that documentary of his, actually has so much footage of people being actually killed and stabbed and run over by tanks and stuff that I can't show you the trailer for that film. I can only show you the stuff from the main part of the movie that really does make a case that maybe the Duck Dynasty guy is the next Jesus. The same guy from the administration and the campaign is the one who worked for a time at Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 was a Texas billionaire's experiment in the 90s to try to make humans live for years in giant terrariums with no link to the outside world. Steve Bannon's time running Biosphere 2 ended in a lawsuit where one of the female terrarium dwellers accused him of screaming at her that he would take her safety concerns about the biosphere and, quote, ram them down your effing throat. Bannon actually admitted to saying exactly that in the court case. And that was just a couple of years before police were called to his home, and he ended up charged with domestic violence and battery, as well as charges that he was trying to interfere with his wife's ability to testify against him in that domestic violence case. Those charges were later dropped when, in fact, his wife didn't turn up to court to testify about the charges. That was also before we learned about the reported meth house that he rented and where he received his mail in Florida. And now that you mention it, that was before we learned about him being registered to vote in multiple states at the same time, while also leading a crusade in the Trump White House against supposed voter fraud. I mean, there are a lot of people who were weird choices in the Trump campaign and in the Trump administration once they won. People who just don't make sense in terms of where they came from and where they ended up. But at least with most of them, there's this common thread that they all have unusual ties to Russia. And we're working on unraveling that one and explaining it all in the end. But with Steve Bannon, he's the weird tie himself. 1 year ago yesterday, Steve Bannon was brought on board to replace Paul Manafort at the head of the Trump campaign. He and Kellyanne Conway came on as a package deal. Both of them had been working for pro-Trump outlets of different kinds that were both funded by the same reclusive right-wing billionaire, Robert Mercer, who was the single largest donor overall to the effort to elect Trump president. Even though Bannon was taking over the campaign chairman role from Paul Manafort, he insisted instead on being called the campaign CEO. Okay. Once he was installed as senior White House strategist, Steve Bannon insisted that it be made publicly known that his chief strategist role was of equal rank to being White House chief of staff. He then named himself to the National Security Council before that national security advisor, the first one, got fired and the new one kicked him out of there. Well, now, as of today, he's gone from the White House altogether with a flourish of random contradictory information about how exactly he left, how much he jumped and how much he was pushed. The line they're trying to sell now from the Bannon side is that it was an orderly goodbye, that it was on his terms, that he filed his notice that he would leave 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was 10 days ago, or maybe it was a week ago. He at least definitely had already decided to leave on his own terms a long time ago. And everybody knew he was leaving, including him. And that's all fine if you're going to try to sell that line, except for the fact that 3 nights ago, he made an unsolicited call to the American Prospect to brag about all the people in the administration who he's about to fire, who he, Steve Bannon, is going to be firing really soon. None of those people are fired, but Bannon is, declaring victory all the way. So, obviously, this is another landmark moment in the disillusion of the Trump administration. But we'll be talking about that over the course of the next hour. And I just want to focus on a few things that we're chewing on right now and trying to answer. Stuff that hasn't been answered yet that I'm hoping we might get answered over the course of this evening. Number one, when do we get normal Sleepy Fridays back? When can we have a slow news day, particularly on a Friday? Ever? Never? Okay, so that's one. 2, Carl Icahn just left the administration tonight as well. He left the administration, quit his job literally moments before the New Yorker magazine published this piece about billionaire Carl Icahn using his position in the Trump administration to make potentially hundreds of millions of dollars for his own companies. Moments before that was published tonight at the New Yorker's website, Carl Icahn resigned. Is that resignation by Carl Icahn a standalone Carl Icahn potential corruption story? Or is his resignation tonight tied in any way to the Steve Bannon departure earlier today? Also, who else is leaving the administration right away, either just to take advantage of the smokescreen created by Steve Bannon's departure, or because they were tied to Bannon, and now that Bannon's gone, they don't have any political means of staying? Number 3, Eric Prince, the billionaire brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and the founder of the military contractor Blackwater. Politico.com reports tonight that big meeting on Afghanistan today, which was the supposed reason Mike Pence had to fly home early from his overseas trip, Politico reports now that Eric Prince, the Blackwater guy, was due to be at that Afghanistan meeting in person today at Camp David to pitch his idea in person that the Trump administration should pay him $10 billion a year to run the Afghanistan war from here on out as Eric Prince's own for-profit private enterprise instead of something being run by the U.S. military. According to this new reporting tonight, Steve Bannon was the one who was Eric Prince's chief ally in favor of this idea. Once Steve Bannon got fired today, Eric Prince was blocked from attending that Afghanistan meeting at Camp David that he was otherwise going to be at. The person who blocked him, reportedly, was National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Is that true? Are there other cockamamie schemes the administration was rolling along with under Bannon's leadership that will now change course or stop because he's gone? We're sort of chewing on all that tonight. But here's my big question tonight, which I think we actually might be able to figure out with the right reporting in just a moment. Why was Steve Bannon there in the first place? What was he there to do? And at whose behest was he there? And whatever he was sent to do, did he leave now because he accomplished it? There were a lot of other inexplicable people in the Trump campaign and now in the Trump administration. And those people fit another pattern entirely. Russia, as to how they got their place and why they're there. But Bannon really is different. Bannon came on a year ago, out of the blue, to run the Trump campaign, despite the fact that with his personal background, he probably couldn't get a commercial driver's license, let alone control of a major party presidential campaign. But he got that gig specifically because the people who funded Bannon at Breitbart and who funded all of his other ventures, including his insane movies, by that point, those same people had become the single largest funders of the Trump campaign. And those are the people who installed him on top of the campaign a year ago and who ultimately got him into the White House, into the Oval Office in this senior role that ended today. Why did they want him there? Did he accomplish what he was supposed to do? And what do they want to do next with Bannon out of the White House and now working on the outside? We've actually got expert reporting on that next from the reporter who has done more than anybody else in the country to explain the single funder who made this all happen in the first place. Stay with us. That's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.